Resistance to antibiotics could cause 10 million deaths a year from 2050. That's according to the United Nations. Scientists say climate change is another factor driving the looming crisis. Why is there such a risk? And what's being done about it? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Sohail Rahman. The United Nations and scientists worldwide are warning that unless urgent action is taken to deal with resistance to antibiotics, a crisis much bigger than the COVID-19 pandemic could occur by 2050. The UN estimates as many as 10 million people could die every year from what's known as antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. That's many more deaths in just 1 year than the 7 million lives lost during the pandemic. So why is this happening and what can be done to address it? We'll discuss that in detail with our guest shortly. But first, let's take a quick look at the problem. A recent report by the UN Development Programme says a major driver is climate change, fueling the rise of global antimicrobial resistance. This happens when bacteria, viruses, fungi or other parasites develop the ability to resist drugs designed to kill them. Disease-causing bacteria and other microbes have historically been limited by geography, and cooler temperatures have prevented diseases from spreading extensively. But climate change is disrupting these barriers. A warmer planet is bringing in more diseases. Floods and droughts are disrupting water systems and sanitation facilities, creating breeding grounds for microbes. Health experts say a critical way to stop these superbugs is to curb the overuse and misuse of antibiotics. Measures to halt climate change will also help in the battle against antimicrobial resistance. Well, let's bring in our guest for this edition of Inside Story. In Geneva, Mukesh Kapila, an advisor for the World Health Organization, specifically on antimicrobial resistance. He's also a Professor Emeritus of Global Health and Humanitarian Affairs at the University of Manchester. In Beirut, Farra, an infectious diseases specialist for Doctors Without Borders, and recently co-wrote a piece addressing the development and spread of antibiotic-resistant bacteria in Gaza. And in Oxford, in the UK, Alistair Farley, scientific lead at Ineos Oxford Institute for Antimicrobial Research, who specialises in bacterial resistance. A warm welcome to all of you on the programme. Mukesh, could I just begin with you? There are two ways, perhaps, of looking at this and what's happening, is that we have this scenario in our heads around the world that the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, has had a huge impact on our psyche. So how has the pandemic really focused scientists and medical minds in general about global infections?
I think recent pandemics, most latterly COVID, have shown the world the dangers that lie when bugs go out of control. They spread across regions and continents and making millions and billions of people vulnerable. And new organisms, new pathogens are coming up all the time. And 2 or 3 of them every year have potential for causing pandemics. Now, antimicrobial resistance is a pandemic in its own right because of the way it infects. It is prevalent across all continents, the way it can affect everybody, rich and poor, north and south. And it's even worse because it is a kind of slow-growing pandemic, and it's not amenable to simple solutions. That's why I think likening it to a pandemic is appropriate, but unfortunately, that doesn't convey the complexity of the problem we face at the present time.
Now, hopefully we'll unpick it as we go along on this edition of Inside Story. Alistair Farley in Oxford, as Mukesh said, a slow-growing pandemic. Would you agree with that?
No, absolutely. I agree with that. There are parallels with the COVID pandemic, but it's a slow-growing one. And if we don't take action appropriately and we don't prepare adequately, then the consequences could be worse than those we've experienced during COVID.
Anna, let me just bring you in quickly, because obviously you and your colleagues at Doctors Without Borders, also known as MSF, do work all over the world, not just in conflict zones, but in climate disaster areas. Obviously, these scenarios occur when the infrastructure of those areas collapses. How is it presenting in general to your colleagues who are noticing this, you might say, at the forefront of medical care?
So we're noticing it in as our first speaker said, these bugs know no boundaries. And even in places where we were not expecting to see a lot of resistance, we are seeing it even there, where we were assuming that not a lot of antimicrobials would be used. And this changes a bit, makes us change the ways we need to treat patients, and maybe we need to prepare in another way in all emergencies.
It's a very difficult scenario, isn't it? You might say a conflict zone and a natural disaster. They have their own issues and they raise their own problems. Mukesh, I mean, you were in Sudan, I believe, as well, in the Darfur area. We're also seeing events unfold in places like Brazil, where there was heavy flooding recently. We've had the storms in the Caribbean. And, of course, we've got the ongoing conflict in Gaza. How different or similar are these areas when it comes to these microbes and bacteria showing, you might say, their ugly face?
I think all the situations of disasters, wars, and conflicts are different. They have their own specificities. However, the underlying risks and vulnerabilities they create are eerily similar. So, for example, when you are living in a prolonged conflict, as we see now in Sudan, or a chronic crisis like in Syria, or an acute hot war like in Gaza and parts of Ukraine, what we're seeing is that health systems are breaking down. We see the basic access to healthcare is disrupted. What that means is that when patients need urgent healthcare, they don't necessarily have access to the optimal configuration of pharmaceutical agents required. Basically, the doctors will make do with whatever is available, and very often the patients will not get properly treated. Instead of having a full course of antibiotics, they might only be able to afford or have access to maybe 3 days, which means that these situations become hotbeds of resistance, because the bugs then adapt to the conditions in these regions. And we see this with climate change as well. That means that organisms like bacteria, viruses, and so on, they replicate faster, thus creating the conditions for the resistance to genetically be embedded in the population of organisms that causes disease in human beings all over. So we see a remarkable commonality despite the diversity around the world.
Alistair, can I just bring you in here as well? Because what we are hearing is that there is this alarm bells being run across the world, and by very eminent figures. I mean, if I just mention Jeannie Mazzara, she's the lady that took over from Anthony Fauci after the COVID-19 scenario, certainly from the American side of things. She's now the new head of that whole health department across the US. She's talked about livestock being overfed and being treated with antibiotics all the time. And it's that very livestock that humans eat. And therefore, within our own bodies, we become, you might say, immune to the health care that we would expect if we were to fall ill. I mean, this cycle of food generation and taking it in, how much of a problem does the food chain create for us in this scenario?
Well, I think one thing that's been absolutely clear is that we are one planet. We are all connected. Antimicrobial resistance doesn't know any boundaries, any national or geographic boundaries. And likewise, there is a link between antimicrobial use in medicine and in agriculture. Something around between 60 and 75% of antibiotics by mass worldwide so by weight, are used in agriculture in some form. And in some cases, this is used to treat an infection, but in many cases, it's used preventatively. And therefore, to prevent the widespread spread of an infection across a flock. Now, the wash-off for this can spread out into the environment, for example, and that is documented. But what is clear is that use of antibiotics in agriculture is spreading resistance. So specific resistance genes that confer resistance to human drugs is exacerbated by use in agriculture.
You're all nodding in agreement. If I just come back to Anna, I mean, what we are seeing certainly in conflict zones, and if we just come to something like Gaza, just as one incident, one story, is that when you have the infrastructure of a location destroyed and you have the water supply disrupted, this all exacerbates the problem of spreading disease, and you might say disease metamorphosing or changing into new forms that are very difficult to treat. How much of a problem is it to have medical locations destroyed, be it in a conflict zone or by natural disaster, and then trying to rebuild them quickly so the disease doesn't spread and these sorts of microbes don't become prevalent?
So in conflict zones, you have the destruction of the medical infrastructure, meaning that people can seek healthcare or not able to get the healthcare or the medication or whatever. So that's this part. You don't get treated in the right way or get the necessary treatment. Then there's the second part, which is the regular all around you infrastructure, the water. You don't get water properly. Maybe your house is destroyed. Maybe, where you live is destroyed. You have to move. You have to go somewhere else. Your living conditions change. So the diseases can spread. So things like cholera with water or other diseases can spread. These could or could not be resistant. But even if you're sick, you become more prone to get other resistance. You increase the use of antimicrobials if it's available, but also you become more prone to getting disease because of stress, because of your food, water, you can't wash yourself, hygiene. So all these factors play in.
What sort of research?
Comes to spread of disease.
Yeah, I'm going to bring Alistair in there because you're doing a lot of research within countries such as Pakistan, South Asia, the Americas, where you're looking into, are you not, about how these antimicrobials actually affect the long-term scenario of a disaster once it's hit and gone?
So, with colleagues, we have a series of global surveillance programs, looking in part in conflict zones and after natural disasters, but just more generally, one of the big issues is diagnostics. Is working out what are the bacteria. Is it a bacterial infection, and therefore you should use antibiotics, and also what type of bacteria, and not only that, what type of resistance genes do they have? So what drugs are they resistant to? And I think if you can work that out, and if you can get cheap and accessible diagnostics coupled with ready availability of the right antibiotics, along with good healthcare and sanitation, then we will be able to tackle problems like antimicrobial resistance.
Alistair, there's this connection, though, now, isn't there, with climate change? I mean, when did that actually dawn on, you might say, the scientists or the researchers, in your understanding?
I mean, it's not something that's just been discussed over the last 6 months or so. This is something that's been going, it's becoming more prevalent now. The discussions are gaining momentum. But what's clear is that climate change is exacerbating extreme weather events. And we're seeing that, whether it's flooding, whether it's hurricanes that we're seeing at the moment. And all these things disrupt basic healthcare and sanitation. And this leads inevitably to a spread of diseases, including those caused by bacteria. And therefore, antimicrobial resistance spreads.
Yeah, and I know you are agreeing in theory as well. Mukesh, I'd like to come to you really as a figure who's travelled the world for the UN as well. I mean, are you linking or are you sort of nodding in agreement generally with what Alistair said, that there is this link now and it's becoming more and more evident and that it has to be dealt with at a very high level, governmental level?
Yes, I would agree with that. But I would also say that there is, unfortunately, not a lack of urgency about this whole problem. And the glacial pace of action in terms of global mobilization and national action is very poor. I mean, I'm a strategic advisor to the World Health Organization on antimicrobial resistance. And every month we are battling with this problem of how to turn global guidance on good practices and technologies and science, and we really know how to deal with these issues. And how do you convince governments around the world, especially those in developing countries and poor countries who don't have the national capacities to deal with this, but not just also in the richer world, you have complete complacency, and in the developing world, you have a lot of lack of awareness about this. And now how to accelerate that action so that we can have a public health movement that is can thwart this problem before it implodes on a much bigger scale than we're seeing at the moment. It's really the issue. That's why the upcoming meeting of the United Nations, the high-level forum in September on antimicrobial resistance, is a seminal event where we might get more global engagement and resources. More resources are needed in countries to build up their surveillance, to build up their laboratories, to build up their reporting capacities, and some kind of global cooperation to be accelerated so we can get to grips with this problem.
Yeah, I just want to come to that UN General Assembly meeting in September in a moment. Just want to go back quickly to Anna. You're nodding your head as well in agreement with both of our other speakers, because I wanted to ask you, yes, it's all very well, isn't it, at the government level for this to be made aware, but at the end of the day, you're at the grassroots level, at the coalface to a certain extent. How do you get your voice heard, and how do you get the voices of your doctors and medics heard when you have these incidents occur, these bacteria arising on the scene that need to be made aware of to the wider medical circle?
I think this is the point, making the world aware. And I would like to go back to the diagnostics part that both of my co-speakers talked about. Diagnostics is key. To know that if we talk about bacteria, you need to know that you have a bacteria first, and then you need to know that it's resistance. And where we work, I can say that only in the areas we work, we usually use the diagnostics. We try to use a local diagnostic, a local lab. And only in it's less than 40% of the places where we work, where we actually can find a lab that has a good quality enough that we can work with. So in 60% of the time, we have to come with our own and build our microbiology lab. And knowing your problem is where it starts. And a lot of places, we don't know what the problem is. So we have tools that so we've tried to make the diagnostics lighter. So we have like the tools that we have to make it easier for people. So there's a part of capacity building. There's a part of consumables. There is the infrastructure for it. So we've tried to make it a little bit easier. So we have something called the mini lab. We have the Antibiotic app, and you can use your smartphone to be able to interpret these sensitivities easier. So I would like to make a call for that.
Yeah, but time is your enemy, isn't it, really, to a certain extent, to try and get that voice heard and get those findings actually out there to those people that can make the difference. Alistair, can I come in here? Because Mukesh just mentioned the UN General Assembly meeting where various reports, for example, the WHO Strategic and Technical Advisory Group for Antimicrobial issues are placed. Not only do you have the UN General Assembly, but we've also got the COP29 conference happening in Baku in Azerbaijan, which again links to climate change. How high up the agenda should this be when you go to the UN General Assembly, you're on the sidelines there, and then you most probably will be on the sidelines of the COP meeting as well later in the year, to get your voice heard, to get your findings out there and to tell people this is what's happening?
I mean, there are many competing issues and problems facing the world at the moment. Antimicrobial resistance is a really big growing problem. And what we want to do is to prevent the unthinkable being the inevitable. This is something that we need to safeguard the use of antibiotics, which underpin modern medicine for a variety of things. So they're used to treat infections, but they're also used for patients with other diseases. So, for example, in chemotherapy, you often take antibiotics. Routine surgery may no longer be possible if AMR is a problem. So what we need to do, along with all the other issues like climate change, is plan for the future. And that's why we're talking, raising this issue now.
Mukesh, can I just bring you in here? I think you want to. I mean, how linked are these two conferences now in terms of getting the debate going, not only in September in New York, but later on in Azerbaijan?
Well, having worked all my life in the UN, I wish I could say that all these UN conferences were linked together. They are not. They are all following their own tracks, good tracks, and no doubt they will say good things and maybe have some good outcomes. But we're not good at interconnecting global issues. But I want to also comment one thing. Sure, new technologies, new techniques, handheld technologies, for example, in conflict zones, provide part of the answers. But the fact of the matter is that we are constantly looking for new ways to solve problems when we are not even doing the basics. So, for example, we have the problem of hospital infections, which is a major cause of the spread of AMR. We have, for example, the lack of healthcare, universal health coverage has been going down or is not there, or is not advancing. And we're looking for some kind of a vertical solution to antimicrobial resistance when what we need to do is to attend to the basics. There isn't going to be a magic solution or a new gizmo that is going to solve this problem. We have to deal with the fundamental building blocks of healthy societies, whether it is a peaceful world, or it is a more equitable world, or a world where whatever available healthcare resources are available, they are antimicrobial resistance integrated into them. I think if we go down the route of AMR as another disease to be solved alongside other diseases and health problems being one of many other problems facing the world, then I'm afraid AMR will always come low down the list. So I'm for more integrated, comprehensive approaches, this being one of many problems. And we don't want a competition between my problem is bigger than your problem or that person's conflict is bigger than my disaster. But I think we need this more kind of unified approach, and everyone has a role, whether you're a patient or a doctor or an environmentalist.
Yeah, I think the other two speakers agree. Alistair, can I just bring you in here? I mean, how much money is there being poured into this research to try and find solutions to AMRs?
If the same amount of money that was poured into finding solutions for COVID, and when governments were forced to act, they did. They poured money into it. They subsidized the companies to develop new therapies. We would develop new antibiotics quite quickly. And one of the issues as well is that many companies have withdrawn from the field of development of new antibiotics. In many cases, the economic returns that you typically see with other therapeutic areas are just not there. And so we need more funding from government and global organizations from the private sector in the form of donations or other research partnerships to continue the basic research to find new treatments. So
are you basically saying that Big Pharma's not interested if there's not a big profit margin involved?
No, it's more complicated than that. But what I will say is that the economic incentives for developing a new drug, for a new antibiotic, is just not there. So you're developing a last resort antibiotic that would be used in extreme cases. So you don't want to use it widely. And most antibiotics work most of the time, and they're really cheap. Generally cheap, readily available, which is in part why they're used in agriculture and so on. And the problem occurs when these common antibiotics no longer work.
Mukesh, I think you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I think it's well covered. The problem with developing new antibiotics is the perverseness. If you get a brilliant new antibiotic and you kind of start using it, then before you know where you are, there's going to be resistance to it, because resistance is a natural phenomenon. It's been with us since the first antibiotic 70 years ago. So regardless of the business model, this is not going to be fundable anyway. So we need a public goods approach as opposed to an individual companies coming in and developing this or that antibiotic approach. The other thing is, again, do the easy stuff. The European Union, for once, the European Union has done something good, and that is really outlawed the excessive use of antimicrobials. As a result, over the last few years, antibiotic use has really gone down in Europe. Of course, that's generated political problems. We've had farmers in France, Belgium, and many other countries rioting, including leading to the political uncertainties you see in Europe nowadays. So the politicization of the AMR agenda, we're now beginning to see, alongside the politicization of the climate change agenda. So if you put that into that context, we also see the challenge ahead that we have to face, regardless of the technical solutions or the amount of money we throw at it.
Anna, we're coming to the end of the programme. I'd like to give you the final say, being at the forefront of looking after people who have this problem, and you're facing it, and so are your colleagues. What would your appeal be to the movers and the shakers who can really make the decisions as to how to, you might say, stop AMRs actually even occurring in common society when there are conflict zones or climate change has affected a community?
I think we need to go back to basics. Like Mukesh said, prevention is key, and to have accessibility to proper living condition, hygiene, etc. The basics. Prevention, vaccination, clean water. These are prerequisites for preventing antimicrobial resistance. We need to think of antimicrobial resistance not as a vertical thing. It really needs to be integrated in everything you do. A little bit like when you're thinking of climate change. We need to think about it in every gesture we do every day.
Yeah. It
needs to be the same.
Well, let's hope it can be in some shape or form. But for the moment, we have to leave it there. We have come to the end of our programme. I'd like to thank all of my guests, Mukesh Kapila, Farra and Alistair Farley. And thank you as well for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle there is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sohail, Rahman, and all of the team here, thanks for your time and your company.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.